Stay with me, because in less than 60 seconds, a single piece of paper is going to make a millionaire wish he had never opened that door. The courtroom doors swung inward with a low, echoing creak that seemed to ripple through every polished surface in the room, and all eyes turned at once as Olivia Hayes stepped inside, her heels striking the marble floor in steady, deliberate rhythm, each step measured, controlled, final, as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times and still felt the weight of it pressing against her chest, not as fear, but as something colder, something sharper, something earned. And at the far end of the room, seated beside his attorney in a perfectly tailored navy suit, Ethan Cole didn't recognize her at first. Not really. Not beyond a flicker of familiarity that passed across his face like a shadow he couldn't quite place, because the woman walking toward him now was nothing like the one he had last seen 5 years ago, the woman he had dismissed, erased, forgotten. And yet there was something in her eyes, something unshakable, that made his posture stiffen almost imperceptibly, the kind of reaction a man has when instinct whispers before logic can catch up. And Olivia didn't rush. She didn't look around. She didn't acknowledge the murmurs beginning to rise in soft waves behind her, because she already knew what they saw, what they thought, what they expected, and she let them think it, let them settle into their assumptions, because in exactly a few moments, every one of those assumptions would collapse under the quiet weight of truth. And as she reached the center of the room, she paused just long enough to set a slim folder on the polished wooden table, the sound soft but precise, a small, controlled impact that somehow carried more authority than any raised voice ever could. And for a brief second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full, dense with anticipation, with something about to happen that no one can stop. And Ethan's attorney leaned forward, brows tightening, eyes scanning Olivia with a mixture of curiosity and irritation, as if trying to place her role in a narrative he believed he already controlled. But Olivia didn't speak yet, not immediately, because she understood timing, understood that silence, when used correctly, becomes a weapon sharper than any argument. And Ethan finally shifted in his seat, his fingers brushing the edge of the table as if grounding himself, his expression hardening into that familiar confidence he had worn like armor for years, the confidence of a man who believed outcomes could be managed, controlled, negotiated. But even as he straightened his tie and prepared to dismiss whatever interruption this was, there was a hesitation, subtle but real, a crack so small most people wouldn't notice it, except Olivia did, because she had once known every version of him, every expression, every shift in tone, and she recognized that hesitation instantly, the way you recognize a sound you haven't heard in years but never truly forgot. And then, finally, she spoke, her voice calm, even, almost quiet, but it carried, cutting clean through the tension like a line drawn with absolute precision. You should have checked what you signed 5 years ago. And the words landed with a weight that didn't need volume to be felt, because they weren't just a statement. They were a door opening backward in time, pulling everything in the room with it, dragging them toward a night most of them had never seen but were about to understand. And as Ethan's eyes narrowed, confusion flickering into something sharper, Olivia gently opened the folder, revealing a single document, the top edge crisp, untouched, undeniable, and she placed it flat on the table between them, not pushing it toward him, not forcing it into his hands, just letting it exist there, undeniable and patient, because she knew he would look, he wouldn't be able not to. And in that moment, before anyone else could fully grasp what was happening, before the whispers turned into questions, before the tension broke into chaos, Olivia Hayes allowed herself exactly one breath, steady and controlled, because this wasn't the beginning of her story. It was the moment everything came back to collect what had always been owed. The document rested between them, like something alive, silent but impossible to ignore, and Ethan's eyes dropped to it despite himself, drawn by that quiet certainty Olivia carried, as if she already knew the outcome of every move that followed. And for a brief second he did not touch it, did not reach forward, because something in him understood that the moment he did, whatever illusion of control he had left would begin to unravel. But pride has a way of overriding instinct, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he leaned in, his fingers brushing the edge of the paper, and the room seemed to tighten around that single motion. The faint hum of overhead lights suddenly louder, the distant shuffle of someone shifting in their seat echoing more than it should, and Olivia watched him without blinking, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, because she had already lived through the part that required fear, and this part, this moment, belonged entirely to her. And as Ethan's eyes moved across the first line, something subtle shifted in his face, not shock, not yet, but confusion, a fracture forming in the certainty he had built his life upon. And his attorney leaned closer, whispering something under his breath, but Ethan did not respond, because the words on the page demanded his full attention, every line precise, every detail documented, a timeline that stretched back years further than he had expected, further than he had prepared for. And Olivia spoke again, her voice still calm, almost measured. You remember that night, do you not? The one you called a clean break, the one where you said everything had already been settled. And the question was not really a question. It was a reminder, a key turning in a lock he had tried to seal shut. And suddenly the courtroom was no longer just a courtroom. It was a doorway, and beyond it waited a memory he had never truly erased, just buried beneath layers of convenience and carefully rewritten narratives. And Olivia let the silence stretch just long enough for that memory to begin surfacing, for the edges of it to sharpen, for the past to stop feeling distant and start feeling immediate, because she understood something most people did not, that the most powerful moment in any story is not the reveal itself, but the second right before it, when the truth is still forming, still rising, still unavoidable. And Ethan's jaw tightened as he looked up, his voice controlled but no longer effortless. What is this supposed to be? And Olivia did not rush to answer, did not fill the space with explanations, because explanation weakens impact, and instead she simply placed her hand lightly on the corner of the document, grounding it there as if anchoring the entire room to that single point. And when she finally spoke, her words were precise, deliberate, impossible to misinterpret. This is the part you never read. And the statement landed heavier than anything raised in anger ever could, because it carried with it not just accusation, but inevitability. And across the room, someone shifted again, the sound sharp in the stillness. And Ethan's attorney reached for the document now, quicker, more urgent, scanning the lines with practiced speed. But even that practiced confidence began to falter as the implications settled in, and Olivia's gaze never left Ethan, because she was not here for the room, not for the whispers, not for the reactions unfolding in slow waves behind her. She was here for the moment he realized exactly what he had signed, exactly what he had overlooked, exactly what had been waiting all this time, patient and unchanged. And as that realization began to take shape, subtle but undeniable, Olivia felt something shift inside her, not relief, not satisfaction, but something quieter, something steadier, the feeling of a balance long disrupted finally beginning to return. And she took one small step back, giving the truth space to do what it always does when it is finally seen. And in that space, the past started to speak louder than anything either of them could say. And just like that, the room was no longer anchored in the present, because memory has a way of rising when it is called by truth. And for Ethan, it came back in fragments at first, the sound of rain against glass, the dull glow of a hallway light, the weight of a decision he had convinced himself was necessary, efficient, final. And Olivia watched it happen in real time, saw the recognition forming behind his eyes even before he admitted it to himself, because 5 years ago had not been as clean as he claimed, not as simple as the story he told his colleagues, his friends, even the court. And now that story was beginning to crack, piece by piece, revealing something far less controlled beneath it. And her voice came again, softer this time, but no less precise. You said everything was settled that night, that there was nothing left between us. And she let that sentence hang for a moment, because she knew exactly where it would lead him, back to a small office with dim lighting and a stack of documents placed neatly on a desk, back to a version of himself who had been impatient, distracted, eager to move forward without looking back. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the paper as if grounding himself in the present. But it was too late for that, because the past was no longer distant. It was unfolding, vivid and unavoidable. And he could see it now. Olivia sitting across from him that night, quiet, composed, her hands folded in her lap in a way he had interpreted as resignation. But what he had not seen then, what he had not even considered, was that stillness is not always surrender. Sometimes it is preparation. And Olivia had been preparing long before he realized there was anything to prepare for. And the attorney beside him flipped another page, faster. Now, more urgent, scanning, calculating, adjusting. But even that practiced rhythm was beginning to falter, because the language in the document was clear, deliberate, impossible to reinterpret once fully understood, and Ethan's voice, when it came, was lower, less certain. This was already reviewed, he said, as if repeating it would make it true, and Olivia shook her head once, slowly, not dismissive but final. No, she said. It was presented, not reviewed, and that distinction landed harder than any accusation, because it exposed not just an oversight, but a choice, a moment where he had decided that details did not matter, that signatures were enough, that moving forward was more important than understanding what he was leaving behind. And across the room, the quiet murmurs had returned, softer now, but more focused, as if the atmosphere itself had shifted from curiosity to realization, and Olivia took a breath, steady and controlled, because this was the turning point, the place where the past stopped being a memory and became evidence, and she reached into the folder again, not hurried, not dramatic, just precise, and withdrew a second document, placing it beside the first with the same quiet certainty, aligning the edges as if order itself carried meaning. And for a moment she said nothing, because she did not need to. The presence of that second document spoke for her, hinted at layers he had not considered, details he had not accounted for, and Ethan's gaze moved between the two pages now, faster, sharper, the confidence he had entered with no longer intact, replaced by something more fragile, something searching, and Olivia finally met his eyes fully. Not with anger, not with triumph, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, because what was happening here was not sudden, not accidental. It was the result of a single moment 5 years ago when he chose not to read, and everything that followed had been quietly waiting for this exact second to be seen, to be understood, to be undeniable. The second document did not need to be explained, not immediately, because its presence alone shifted the weight of the room, and Ethan could feel it before he fully understood it. The way pressure builds before a storm breaks, subtle but undeniable, and his attorney reached for it this time without hesitation, flipping it open with sharper movements, scanning faster. But the speed only made the silence heavier, because the faster he read, the more obvious it became that this was not a simple addition, not a minor clause, but something foundational, something that connected directly to the first document in a way that had never been acknowledged. And Olivia stood still, letting that connection form on its own, because forced understanding is weak, but realized truth has a permanence that cannot be undone. And Ethan leaned forward. Now, closer than before, his earlier composure no longer intact, his attention fixed on the lines that seemed to rearrange everything he thought he knew. And Olivia spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. "You signed both on the same night," she said, her voice carrying evenly across the room. "But only one was explained to you." And the distinction landed with quiet precision, because it revealed not just omission, but imbalance, a moment where knowledge had been unevenly distributed and decisions had been made under that imbalance. And Ethan's brow tightened, his mind moving quickly now, reconstructing that night with new context, new questions, new gaps that suddenly felt significant. And he remembered the urgency, the way his phone had kept vibrating with messages, the way he had glanced at the clock more than once, impatient to leave, impatient to close that chapter of his life and move forward into something cleaner, something easier. And Olivia had said very little that night, had not argued, had not interrupted, had simply waited until the papers were placed in front of him, until the pen was offered, until the moment came when he could choose to read or to trust the summary he had been given. And he had chosen the summary, chosen speed over detail, chosen assumption over certainty. And now that choice was unfolding in front of him with a clarity that could not be ignored. And his attorney paused, just for a second, a rare hesitation that spoke louder than any objection, because whatever he was seeing was not easily dismissed, not easily reframed. And Olivia took one small step forward, closing the distance just enough to anchor the moment, her presence steady, controlled, and she placed her fingertips lightly on the edge of the second document, aligning it again with the first, as if reinforcing that they were never separate to begin with, that they had always been part of the same structure, the same agreement, the same decision. And Ethan finally looked up at her fully, not past her, not through her, but at her, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty. "What does this prove?" he asked, and Olivia held his gaze without hesitation, because she had waited years for that exact question, the moment when he would stop dismissing and start asking. And when she answered, her words were measured, deliberate, impossible to misinterpret. "It proves that what you thought was finished never actually was." And the statement settled into the room with a quiet finality, because it did not accuse, it did not argue. It simply established a reality that had been overlooked, and around them, the atmosphere shifted again. The earlier curiosity replaced by something more focused, more attentive, as if everyone present could sense that they were no longer watching a routine proceeding, but something unfolding with deeper consequences. And Olivia drew a slow breath, steady and controlled, because this was the moment where understanding began to solidify, where confusion started to give way to realization, and she could see it happening. See the connections forming in Ethan's expression, the pieces aligning in a way that could not be reversed. And she knew that from this point forward, everything would move faster, sharper, because once truth begins to surface, it does not stop halfway. It continues until there is nothing left hidden, nothing left unresolved, nothing left to deny. The realization did not arrive all at once. It moved slowly, deliberately, like something unfolding layer by layer, and Ethan could feel it happening as his eyes moved again across the documents, not skimming now, but searching, tracing every line as if the meaning might change if he looked closely enough. But the words remained exactly what they were, precise, structured, and entirely outside the version of events he had built in his mind for the past 5 years. And his attorney cleared his throat quietly, a subtle signal that something was no longer routine, that the ground they had been standing on was no longer as stable as it seemed. And Olivia noticed it. Of course she did, because she had spent years learning how to read moments like this, how to recognize the exact point where confidence begins to give way to calculation. And she did not interrupt, did not rush, because urgency belonged to them now, not to her. And that shift in control was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost invisible, but it was absolute. And Ethan finally spoke again, slower this time, choosing his words more carefully. "This does not change anything," he said, but the statement lacked the weight it once would have carried. It sounded more like an attempt to hold on to something already slipping, and Olivia tilted her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement, as if she had expected that response, as if it was simply another step in a sequence she had already mapped out. And when she answered, her voice remained steady, grounded. "It changes everything," she said, and she did not raise her tone, did not emphasize the words, because she did not need to. The truth carried its own emphasis, and she reached into the folder once more, her movements consistent, controlled, and withdrew a third document, placing it beside the others with the same careful alignment, creating a sequence that now stretched across the table like a timeline made visible. And for the first time, there was a clear structure emerging, not just isolated pieces, but a pattern, a progression, something that connected the past to the present with undeniable clarity. And Ethan's attention snapped to it immediately, because this was new. This was something he had not anticipated, and his attorney leaned in again, faster now, the urgency no longer hidden, and Olivia spoke as they read, not interrupting but guiding, her words placed with precision. "You thought the agreement ended that night," she said, "but it only started there." And the statement shifted the frame entirely, because it reframed everything that followed, every assumption, every decision, every outcome, and Ethan felt it. The way the narrative he had relied on began to lose its shape, its certainty dissolving into something far less controlled. And Olivia continued, not rushing, not pressing, just revealing. "There was a continuation clause," she said, her eyes steady on his, one that activates when certain conditions are met. And she let that sit for a moment, because she knew exactly how it sounded, how it would land, how it would force him to look. Again, not just at what he had signed, but at what he had overlooked, and the room seemed to tighten once more, the air heavier now, more focused, because this was no longer about interpretation, it was about consequence, and Ethan's jaw set as he turned back to the document, his movements sharper, more deliberate, as if trying to regain control through effort alone. But effort cannot rewrite what is already written. And Olivia watched him, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a calm certainty that had been built over years, because she had known this moment would come, had prepared for it in silence, in patience, in the quiet work of understanding every detail he had ignored. And now that preparation was unfolding exactly as intended, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a precision that left no room for doubt. And as Ethan's expression shifted again, the final pieces beginning to align, Olivia took a slow breath, grounding herself in the present, because this was the point where realization turns into acceptance, where denial loses its hold. And once that happens, there is no going back, only forward into whatever comes next. The words continuation clause did not fade. They lingered in the air with a quiet permanence, and Ethan could feel the weight of them pressing against every assumption he had carried for years, because clauses like that do not exist without purpose, and purpose always leads to outcome. And his eyes moved quickly across the third document now, searching for the exact language, the exact line where everything shifted from past agreement to present consequence. And when he found it, his expression changed in a way that could not be hidden, not fully, because understanding had finally caught up with reality. And Olivia saw it the moment it happened, the exact second when the story he had believed stopped holding together, and she did not interrupt, did not speak over it, because that realization needed space, needed silence, needed to settle into something undeniable. And his attorney leaned closer still, pointing at a section, whispering rapidly, but the speed of those words only emphasized the shift in control, because they were no longer guiding the situation, they were reacting to it, adjusting in real time to something that had already been set in motion long before this moment. And Ethan finally spoke again, but his voice carried a different weight now, less certain, more calculated. This clause is conditional, he said, as if identifying it might contain it, might limit its reach, and Olivia nodded once, a small, precise movement that acknowledged the statement without weakening her position. It is, she said, and the conditions have been met. And the simplicity of that response landed harder than anything complex ever could, because it removed ambiguity, it removed interpretation, it placed the situation firmly in the realm of fact. And for a moment, no one spoke, because the implication of that statement required a different kind of processing, not just intellectual, but structural. It required a reassessment of everything that had followed that original agreement, every decision, every transaction, every step Ethan had taken under the belief that the past was fully resolved. And Olivia allowed that silence to expand, to do its work, because she understood that once people begin to connect those dots themselves, the impact is far stronger than anything she could explain. And then, carefully, deliberately, she placed her hand on the third document, not to emphasize it, but to anchor it, to ensure that it remained the focal point of the moment. And she spoke again, her tone steady, her pacing controlled. The clause activates when material disclosures are incomplete, she said, each word clear, unhurried. And when that happens, the original terms do not close, they extend. And she paused just long enough for that to register, for the meaning to take shape in the room, for the shift from closed to extended to settle into something concrete. And Ethan's expression tightened as he processed it, because extension means continuation, continuation means exposure, and exposure means that the past is no longer separate from the present. It is part of it, integrated into every outcome that followed. And his attorney flipped back to the earlier pages now, cross-referencing, verifying, searching for anything that might contradict what was being presented, but the structure held, the language aligned, the pattern remained consistent, and Olivia stood there, composed, grounded, not pushing, not pressing, because she did not need to. The documents were doing that work for her. the details speaking in a way that could not be dismissed, and she met Ethan's gaze again, not with challenge, but with clarity, because this was no longer about persuasion, it was about recognition. And she could see that recognition forming, slowly but steadily, as the implications became impossible to ignore, and as that realization deepened, Olivia took a slow breath, steady and controlled, because this was the moment where everything shifted from possibility to inevitability, where the question was no longer whether the past would matter, but how much of the present it would reshape. And in that shift, the balance that had once been tilted began to level, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a quiet precision that made it impossible to reverse. The word inevitable did not need to be spoken again, because it had already settled into the room like something permanent, something that could not be undone, and Ethan felt it in the way his thoughts no longer moved forward but backward, retracing decisions, replaying moments, searching for a point where this outcome could have been avoided, but every path led back to the same place, the same night, the same signature placed on documents he had not fully read, and Olivia watched that realization take hold with quiet precision, because this was not a surprise to her. It was a process she had anticipated, mapped, and waited for, and now that it was unfolding, she did not interfere, did not accelerate it, because understanding, once it begins, does not need to be forced. It completes itself, and Ethan's attorney spoke again, more controlled now, but the urgency remained beneath the surface. "We need clarification on the conditions," he said, his tone measured, professional, but no longer dismissive, and Olivia turned her attention to him without hesitation, acknowledging the shift, because questions meant engagement, and engagement meant the structure she had built was now being taken seriously, and when she answered, her voice remained calm, deliberate. "The conditions relate to full disclosure at the time of signing," she said, each word placed with care, "financial, contractual, and asset-based disclosures," and she paused just long enough for that to settle, because those categories were not abstract, they were specific, measurable, and most importantly, verifiable, and Ethan's expression shifted again, more sharply this time, because he understood exactly what that meant, not in theory but in practice. And Olivia continued, her tone steady. "If any of those disclosures were incomplete or inaccurate, the agreement does not finalize." And the statement landed with quiet precision, because it reframed the past not as finished, but as suspended, waiting for completion that had never occurred. And Ethan's hand moved slightly on the table, a small motion, almost involuntary, but it revealed more than any words could, because it showed the moment he recognized the gap, the space between what was declared and what actually existed, and Olivia saw it, the exact second where recognition turned into calculation, where he began to measure the difference, to assess the scale of what had been left unaccounted for, and she did not need to point it out, did not need to emphasize it, because the documents already did that with far more authority than any statement could. And across the room, the atmosphere had shifted entirely, no longer uncertain, no longer speculative, but focused, attentive, as if everyone present understood that they were witnessing something precise, something constructed over time, something that was now unfolding exactly as intended. And Ethan's attorney flipped through the pages again, slower this time, more deliberate, cross-referencing, verifying, because the approach had changed from dismissal to validation, and that change alone marked a turning point. And Olivia remained still, grounded, her presence steady, because she had already done the work that mattered, the quiet preparation, the careful documentation, the patience required to let time reveal what force never could. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm clarity. "The clause does not create a new agreement," she said. "It enforces the original one, under complete terms," and that distinction mattered, because it removed any argument of expansion or overreach. It framed everything as continuity, as completion, as something that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the documents, because he understood. Now that this was not about interpretation, it was about alignment between what was signed and what was true. And as that understanding settled, Olivia took a slow breath, steady and controlled, because this was the moment where resistance begins to weaken, where the effort to maintain an outdated narrative becomes heavier than accepting the reality in front of it. And once that shift happens, everything that follows becomes clearer, sharper, and ultimately unavoidable. By the time the room settled into that new clarity, the tension no longer felt uncertain. It felt directed, focused toward a single outcome that had not yet been spoken but was already understood, and Ethan sat there with the documents spread before him, no longer scanning, no longer searching, but reading with a kind of stillness that only comes when a person realizes the answer is already in front of them. And Olivia could see it in the way his posture had changed, less rigid, less performative, more grounded in something real, something he could not negotiate away. And the attorney beside him adjusted his glasses slowly, carefully, as if buying time, as if recalculating every possible angle. But even that measured composure carried a subtle shift, the confidence now tempered by recognition that the framework they were operating in had expanded beyond their initial assumptions. And Olivia remained exactly where she was, her presence steady, her breathing even, because she had reached the point where action was no longer necessary. Only confirmation, and Ethan finally spoke again, quieter now, but clearer. What exactly was not disclosed? He asked, and the question carried weight, not resistance but acknowledgement, because asking it meant accepting that something had indeed been missing. And Olivia answered without hesitation, her voice calm, precise. 3 asset accounts and 2 contractual holdings, she said, each category defined, measurable, leaving no room for ambiguity. All active at the time of signing. And the specificity of her answer settled into the room with a quiet finality, because it transformed the discussion from theoretical to factual, from possibility to documentation. And Ethan's attorney moved quickly now, flipping through the documents, cross-referencing figures, timelines, signatures. But the more he searched, the more the pattern held, consistent, aligned, impossible to dismiss as oversight or error. And Olivia continued, not pressing but completing the picture. Those omissions triggered the continuation clause, she said, which extends all terms until full disclosure is achieved. And she paused, allowing that to land, because extension was not just a legal concept. It was a bridge between past and present, connecting decisions made years ago to consequences unfolding now. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the documents, his expression no longer defensive, no longer dismissive, but thoughtful, measured, as if he were finally seeing the full structure for what it was, not a collection of isolated moments, but a system, a sequence, something that had been quietly building while he believed it was already over. And Olivia watched him carefully, because this was the moment where understanding becomes acceptance, where the mind stops searching for alternatives and begins to recognize reality as it is. And she spoke again, softer now, but no less clear. Full disclosure was never completed, she said. So the agreement never closed. And the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than anything complex ever could, because it distilled everything into a single, undeniable point. And across the room, the silence deepened, no longer tense, but settled, as if the outcome had already been decided even before it was formally acknowledged. And Ethan's attorney exhaled slowly, setting the documents down with deliberate care, his movements controlled but revealing the shift in position, because there was no longer an argument to be made without addressing the core issue directly. And Olivia took one small step back, not retreating but creating space, because she understood that the final realization could not be forced, it had to arrive on its own. And as Ethan looked up again, meeting her gaze with a clarity that had not been there before, the distance between past and present seemed to collapse entirely, leaving only the truth that had been waiting all along, patient, unchanged, and now impossible to ignore. The silence that followed was not empty. It was settled, the kind of silence that comes when every piece has found its place and there is nothing left to rearrange. And Ethan sat there with the documents still in front of him, no longer questioning, no longer searching, because the structure was complete now, the gaps had been filled, and what remained was not confusion but consequence. And Olivia stood across from him, steady and composed, her presence unchanged from the moment she walked in. Because for her, this was not a turning point. It was a confirmation, something she had already understood long before this room ever existed. And Ethan finally leaned back in his chair, a slow, measured movement that carried more weight than anything he had said before. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of the certainty it once held. "So the agreement is still active," he said. Not as a challenge, but as a realization, and Olivia nodded once, a small, precise acknowledgement. Because that was the truth, simple and complete, and the attorney beside him did not interrupt this time, did not attempt to reframe or redirect, because there was nothing left to reinterpret without addressing the foundation itself, and the room remained still, attentive, as if everyone present understood that the moment had shifted from debate to resolution, and Olivia took a slow breath, steady and controlled, because this was the final step, not dramatic, not loud, but definitive, and she spoke one last time, her voice calm, even, carrying clearly without force. "It has been active this entire time," she said, and the words settled into the space with quiet finality, because they did not accuse, they did not argue. They simply revealed what had always been there, unchanged and waiting, and Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to the documents again, not to read but to acknowledge, to accept the reality they represented. And when he looked back up, there was no resistance left, only recognition. And Olivia held that moment for exactly what it was, not more, not less. Because she understood something that most people never do, that true resolution does not require confrontation. It requires clarity, and once clarity is achieved, everything else follows naturally. And she reached forward, closing the folder with a soft, deliberate motion, gathering the documents not as evidence to present, but as something already fulfilled, something that had completed its purpose. And without another word, she stepped back, creating distance, not out of retreat, but out of completion, because her role in this moment was finished. And as she turned, her heels echoing softly against the marble floor, the sound carried through the room with a quiet rhythm that marked the end of something that had begun long before this day. And no one stopped her, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to say. And Ethan remained where he was, seated, still, the weight of understanding settling into something deeper than reaction, something that would not fade when the room emptied. And Olivia did not look back as she reached the doors, did not pause, because she did not need to. The past had already done what it needed to do. And as the doors opened and she stepped through, the light from the hallway briefly outlining her silhouette before fading behind her, the room remained exactly as it was, quiet, resolved, and undeniably changed. Because some decisions do not end when they are made, they wait, patiently, until the moment they are finally understood.